Michael sat in the green room with a calm that felt borrowed, like it belonged to someone else. His hands rested loosely in his lap, fingers lightly curled, the tremor there but softer today, almost polite. The studio buzzed around him with that chaotic pre-show frenzy he'd grown familiar with over the decades. Makeup brushes tapping, producers whisper yelling, interns speed walking with clipboards pressed to their chests like shields. But under all of it ran a strange current, a kind of static tension he could feel prickling at the edges of the room. Someone had told him in passing that Whoopi Goldberg wasn't thrilled about a segment note the producers had added last minute. Another had joked that, Whoopi's in one of her moods. He'd just laughed. If he stopped doing things every time someone on a TV show had a mood, he'd never leave the house. When they called him to stand by, he stood, rolling his shoulders once, grounding himself. It wasn't nerves, not really. It was more a hyper-awareness, that performer's instinct he'd always had, kicking in even after all these years. As they led him toward the stage doors, he caught bits of conversation from behind him, someone muttering about a timing issue, someone else saying, "Just stick to the approved questions." He brushed it all off. Whatever it was, he could handle it. The View's music hit, bright and bouncy, and the applause swelled as he stepped out. The lights washed over him with their familiar heat, and he smiled automatically, waving at the audience. He could still feel that old electricity when a crowd lit up at his presence, never overwhelming, just warm. Comforting, even. Whoopi was already seated, and as he approached the table, he noticed the stiffness in her posture. Her smile was there, but it didn't touch her eyes the way it usually did. She reached out for a quick handshake anyway, and he matched her energy, not making anything of it. Sometimes live TV started this way, tight, clipped, and smoothed out once everyone found their rhythm. The conversation began easy, nostalgic. They asked about his foundation, his documentary, the new research breakthroughs he was excited about. He spoke clearly, steadily, with that mixture of humor and sincerity he'd honed over decades of public life. Every so often, the audience laughed, and he felt the show beginning to find its flow. But then Whoopi leaned forward, papers in her hand, her voice shifting, gaining an edge. "Michael," she said, "some critics have argued that your recent documentary paints too rosy a picture, that it glosses over the more painful parts of living with Parkinson's. How do you respond to that? Because some viewers feel misled." The air changed instantly. He felt it. Everyone did. Michael kept his posture relaxed, his expression open. "Well, I think anyone who watched it knows it didn't shy away from the hard stuff," he said gently. "But I've always tried to lead with hope. That's just who I am." Whoopi didn't nod, didn't soften. "But don't you think hope can sometimes become a kind of spin? Especially when people look up to you for honesty?" A ripple of discomfort moved through the studio. One of the co-hosts shifted in her chair. Someone in the audience let out a tiny, nervous laugh and was immediately shushed. Michael blinked once, slowly. He wasn't offended. He'd been asked tougher questions in his life. But something about the tone, something pointed, almost confrontational, felt unnecessary. Still, he kept his voice level. "I've never lied about what this disease has taken," he said. "But I won't let it take my joy, too. And I won't apologize for showing people that." Whoopi's eyes narrowed slightly, and she lifted the papers again. "But when you show the good and not the worst, doesn't that?" He cut in, but not sharply. Calmly, quietly. "Whoopi," he said, and his voice carried in that way soft voices sometimes do, silencing a room with sheer sincerity. "People know what the worst looks like. They live it. They see it. My job isn't to remind them of their pain. It's to remind them they're not defined by it." The studio froze. He kept going. "You call it rosy. I call it surviving. I call it choosing light even when everything in your body is telling you to sit down in the dark." He paused, looking directly at her. "And that's not spin. That's work." For a moment, the entire table was motionless. Even the cameras seemed quieter. The audience didn't dare clap yet. They were waiting, breath held, to see how she'd respond. Whoopi opened her mouth, but nothing came out at first. She blinked, looked at her notes, then back at him. Something in her face shifted. Just a twitch, a micro-expression, but he saw it. A flicker of respect, or maybe understanding, maybe even both. One of the co-hosts stepped in with a quick, light-hearted question about his early acting days, clearly trying to ease the tension, but the moment lingered. It hung in the room, unmistakable. Michael smiled, small but real, and answered the new question without missing a beat. The crowd finally exhaled. A few people even clapped, like they'd needed to release the energy trapped inside them. The segment continued, but the shift in the room was unmistakable. The dynamic had changed. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't argued, but he had drawn a line with a gentleness that hit harder than any confrontation could. And even Whoopi, as the cameras cut to commercial, looked over at him, not annoyed, not defensive, but contemplative, as if replaying the exchange in her mind, seeing it from a different angle. By the time the commercial break ended and the cameras blinked awake again, the studio's energy felt different, charged yet oddly fragile, like a storm cloud that hadn't decided whether to break open or drift away. Michael adjusted slightly in his chair, offering the audience a familiar smile as the theme music faded and the red light on the main camera glowed steady. The co-hosts shuffled their cards, exchanging subtle glances, everyone silently agreeing to tread carefully. But Whoopi didn't do careful. She cleared her throat and leaned forward, hands clasped loosely in front of her. Her expression wasn't hostile, not anymore, but it was focused, almost sharpening itself as she studied him. The producers hadn't planned for any follow-up to the earlier exchange, but Whoopi's instincts had always paid little mind to scripts. "Michael," she began, voice lower now, steadier, "I want to go back to something you said before the break." A ripple of quiet immediacy moved through the audience. Even the camera operators shifted, like they were leaning in without meaning to. He nodded, open to whatever was coming. He had never been a man afraid of talking, about struggle, about joy, about anything real. "When you said you choose light," she continued, "it sounded powerful. But some people watching might feel guilty for not being able to do that. For not being able to find light in their own situation. What do you say to them?" This time it wasn't an attack. It wasn't a challenge. It was something else entirely, almost vulnerable. Whoopi didn't phrase it as a jab, she phrased it like someone who had lived days when choosing anything felt impossible. Michael took a breath. The tremor in his hand flickered lightly against the edge of the table, not anxious, just present, part of him the way light comes through a window whether you want it or not. He didn't hide it. He never did. "I don't choose light because I'm strong," he said softly. "I choose it because I've learned. I don't have to do it alone." The studio went still. "I have days where I can't find the good. Days when everything hurts. Days when I feel like a burden. And on those days," he said, glancing at the audience then back at Whoopi, "someone else finds the light for me. My wife, my kids, a stranger who sends a letter, a researcher with a breakthrough. Hope isn't something I manufacture. It's something people hand me when I'm too tired to reach for it myself." He paused, letting the words settle into the space between them. "So for anyone watching who feels guilty for not being positive, don't you dare. Nobody carries the light every day. That's why we take turns." The audience reaction wasn't loud, it was soft, a low, emotional murmur followed by gentle applause that grew slowly, as if people weren't sure whether clapping would break the intimacy of the moment. It didn't. It only made it stronger. Whoopi watched him closely. Whatever frustration she'd started the show with had melted, replaced by something like respect tinged with introspection. Her voice dropped even further. "You know," she said, almost to herself, "I think people forget how human you are. You're not just the guy who keeps fighting. You're also the guy who wakes up hurting." Michael let out a small laugh, warm and self-deprecating. "Oh, I'm definitely the guy who wakes up hurting. I just also happen to be the guy who wakes up anyway." This time the audience laughed gently with him. The air began to soften, the tension unwinding itself thread by thread. But then, because live television has a wicked sense of timing, the next co-host accidentally reignited a spark. "Michael," she said, smiling too brightly, "you're such an inspiration. Honestly, sometimes it's like you don't even look sick." The words hung in the air like a dropped glass. Whoopi's eyes widened. One of the other co-hosts visibly winced. The audience released an awkward chorus of, "Ooh oh hhh," not out of malice, but out of secondhand embarrassment so strong it practically shimmered in the air. Michael didn't flinch. He'd heard that line before, hundreds of times. But this time, something in him decided to answer differently. "That's the funny thing about illness," he said, turning to the host, his tone gentle but firm. "You don't have to look sick to be hurting. And you don't have to look strong to be fighting." The host's smile faltered. She nodded quickly, murmuring an apology, but he wasn't finished. "I don't hide what I'm going through," he said. "But I also don't owe anyone a performance of suffering. My disease doesn't have to be visible for it to be real." Whoopi exhaled, loud enough that her mic picked it up, and shook her head, half amused, half impressed. "That right there," she said, pointing at him, "is why you've done more to educate people about this disease than half the textbooks." Michael chuckled. "Well, I always preferred storytelling to science class." For the first time since the show started, Whoopi genuinely laughed, a deep, unguarded laugh that made the audience clap again. The heaviness in the room broke like sunlight through storm clouds. The segment was supposed to wrap, but Whoopi leaned in again, breaking protocol one more time. "You know what, Michael?" she said, voice warm now. "You shut me down earlier, and I deserved it. But I learned something from it." She tapped the desk lightly. "You reminded me that sometimes the truth isn't loud. It's steady." He just smiled. "I think truth can be whatever it needs to be. Loud when it must, quiet when it helps." The studio lights felt different, warmer somehow, as the producer frantically signaled they were 10 seconds over time, then 20, then 30. Nobody at the table cared. Nobody wanted to cut the moment short. Finally, the outro music rolled in, and Whoopi wrapped the segment with a sincerity that surprised even the other co-hosts. "Michael J. Fox, everybody," she said. "A man who shows us what real strength looks like. Not because he hides the hard stuff, but because he doesn't."